History remembers him as a savior, the Great Emancipator, the man who preserved the Union, the symbol of moral courage in America's darkest hour. But behind the legend of Abraham Lincoln was a man haunted by something far less heroic: melancholy. Long before he entered the White House, Lincoln struggled with severe depression, what people in the 19th century called melancholia. Friends feared for his safety. He spoke openly about his despair. At times, those close to him removed knives and razors from his room. This was not the image carved into marble. This was a man who once said he was the most miserable man living. His childhood was marked by poverty and loss. His mother died when he was 9. His sister died during childbirth. Hard labor defined his early years. And yet, even as he rose through politics, the darkness never fully left. Political defeats piled up. By the time Abraham Lincoln entered the White House in 1861, the nation was already fracturing. 7 southern states had seceded. War was inevitable. But Lincoln was not the flawless moral crusader many imagine. He was a politician, and a highly strategic one. Contrary to popular belief, Lincoln did not begin his presidency with the immediate goal of abolishing slavery everywhere. His primary objective was preserving the Union. If he could save it without freeing a single slave, he once suggested, he would. If freeing some would preserve it, he would do that. If freeing all would preserve it, he would do that. His moral stance evolved, but it evolved alongside political necessity. The Emancipation Proclamation, often portrayed as a purely moral act, was also a calculated wartime strategy. It weakened the Confederacy economically. It prevented European powers from siding with the South. It reframed the war as a moral struggle, not just a constitutional one. Lincoln understood optics. He understood timing, and he understood power. He suspended habeas corpus during the war, allowing the arrest of suspected Confederate sympathizers without trial. Newspapers critical of his administration were shut down. Political opponents were detained. To some, these were necessary wartime measures. To others, they were authoritarian overreach. The man defending democracy had temporarily limited civil liberties. The president preserving freedom had centralized unprecedented executive power. History tends to simplify leaders into heroes or villains. Lincoln was neither. He was navigating a collapsing nation with tools that were often blunt and controversial. And as the war intensified, so did the moral and political compromises. Business ventures failed. Romantic heartbreak nearly shattered him. In 1841, after the collapse of his engagement to Mary Todd, Lincoln fell into what many historians consider a nervous breakdown. He withdrew from public life. Friends monitored him constantly. Some feared he might take his own life. And this was years before the presidency, years before war, years before the bloodshed of the American Civil War. The man who would lead a fractured nation was already fighting a war within himself, and that internal battle would shape the decisions he later made, in ways few people truly understand. By 1862, the American Civil War had become far deadlier than anyone predicted. What many believed would be a short conflict turned into industrial-scale slaughter. And at the center of it all was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln authorized strategies that would redefine modern warfare: total war. General William Tecumseh Sherman's march through the South devastated infrastructure, farms, railroads, and cities. Civilian property was destroyed to break the Confederacy's will.
It was effective. It was brutal. Thousands of families were left without homes or livelihoods. Lincoln backed generals who were willing to fight relentlessly. He replaced commanders who hesitated. He pushed for aggressive campaigns despite staggering casualty numbers. After the Battle of Antietam alone, over 22,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day. Each report of death reached the White House. Each casualty was part of the price of union. Lincoln visited hospitals filled with amputees. He signed letters to grieving mothers. He carried the weight of every battlefield decision. But here is the uncomfortable truth. He knew the war would demand enormous sacrifice, and he chose to continue, because in his mind, preserving the Union justified the cost. Some critics at the time accused him of being indifferent to suffering. Others called him a tyrant, prolonging war for political gain. Yet Lincoln believed that compromise with secession would permanently fracture the nation. He saw the conflict as existential, and existential wars rarely allow for gentle solutions. The image of Lincoln as compassionate and soft-spoken is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. He was capable of ruthlessness when he believed history demanded it. And history, during those years, demanded blood. As the war intensified, so did Lincoln's use of executive power. Abraham Lincoln believed the Union was on the brink of collapse, and in moments of collapse, extraordinary measures often follow. One of his most controversial decisions was the suspension of habeas corpus. This meant individuals suspected of disloyalty could be arrested and detained without immediate trial. Thousands were detained. Journalists, politicians, civilians accused of Confederate sympathies. Newspapers critical of the administration were shut down. In border states, military authority sometimes overrode civil courts. To his supporters, Lincoln was protecting the nation from internal sabotage. To his critics, he was expanding presidential power beyond constitutional limits. The case of ex parte Merryman directly challenged his authority. Chief Justice Roger Taney argued that only Congress could suspend habeas corpus. Lincoln ignored the ruling. He justified his actions with a chilling logic. Was it better to violate one law temporarily or allow the entire nation to collapse? This was the paradox of his presidency. He defended democracy while limiting civil freedoms. He fought for liberty while limiting civil freedoms. But Lincoln understood something few leaders openly admit. War reshapes the boundaries of power. And once expanded, power rarely returns to its original size without resistance. The Civil War not only preserved the Union, it transformed the presidency itself. Stronger, more centralized, more decisive. And Lincoln was the architect of that transformation.
Today, Abraham Lincoln is remembered above all as the man who freed the slaves, the Great Emancipator. But the truth is more complex. At the start of his presidency, Lincoln's priority was not immediate abolition, it was preservation. He feared that pushing too aggressively against slavery would drive border states into the Confederacy. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland. Losing them could mean losing the war. In early speeches, Lincoln stated clearly he did not believe he had constitutional authority to abolish slavery where it already existed. He even supported colonization proposals, ideas suggesting freed Black Americans might resettle outside the United States. These positions make modern audiences uncomfortable because they complicate the myth. But the turning point came as the war dragged on. Slavery was not just a moral issue, it was a strategic one.
It fueled the Southern economy, it sustained Confederate logistics, and it symbolized the very system the Union was fighting against. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But even this was limited. It applied only to states in rebellion, not to slave-holding border states loyal to the Union. It was both a moral statement and a military tactic. It weakened the Confederacy. It discouraged European intervention. It allowed black soldiers to enlist in the Union Army. Over 180,000 African American men would eventually fight for the Union. Lincoln's views evolved. Whether driven by morality, strategy, or both, historians still debate. But evolution does not mean simplicity. The man who ended slavery in America did not begin as an abolitionist firebrand. He became one through war, pressure, and changing conviction. And that transformation is part of his complexity. By April 1865, the war was nearly over. The Union had survived, the Confederacy was collapsing, and Abraham Lincoln had just been re-elected. But victory did not look triumphant. It looked exhausted. Lincoln appeared older than his 56 years. The war had carved itself into his face. Photographs from 1860 to 1865 show a man visibly aged by pressure, grief, and responsibility. He had carried a nation through its bloodiest conflict. Over 600,000 Americans were dead, cities destroyed, families shattered. And though he spoke of reconciliation, with malice toward none, not everyone saw him as a healer. To some in the South, he was a tyrant. To extremists, he was a traitor to their way of life. On April 14, 1865, at Ford's Theater, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth stepped into the presidential box and fired a single shot. The president who had survived political collapse and civil war was killed in a theater. Lincoln died the next morning, and in death, something changed. The complexity began to fade. The controversies softened. The calculations, the compromises, the expansion of executive power, all gradually overshadowed by martyrdom. History prefers clean narratives, heroes without contradiction, villains without nuance. But the real Lincoln was neither flawless nor monstrous. He was a man shaped by depression, driven by ambition, forced into ruthless decisions, and transformed by war. He preserved the Union. He helped end slavery. He expanded presidential power. He suspended civil liberties. He evolved. He calculated. He suffered. And perhaps that is what makes him enduring. Not perfection, but the weight he carried and the choices he made under it.